In 1859, in Yorkshire, Massachusetts, the makeshift quarantine camp erected behind the old Baptist chapel stood veiled in morning frost, its canvas walls already damp with condensation and stained with the dark rust of bodily fluids. Inside, 138 patients lay shoulder to shoulder on cots no wider than a child's cradle, many too weak to cry out, their mouths stuffed with rags to muffle the coughing. Overseen by the township's overseer of the poor, Alden K. Trussell, a pale man with tremulous hands and an unbroken record of civic loyalty. The camp had no official name, only a shipment ledger number, Yard 14. Neighbors remembered Trussell's quiet dignity and his wife's Sunday peach preserves, but behind their homes' shuttered windows, 2 of their domestic servants were buried in unmarked graves within 3 months. The epidemic coincided with an economic downturn and a brutal winter that froze inland wells solid by November. Town records show 361 entries of supply withheld for Yard 14 between January and March. If the illness had a name, it was never written down. Why did no institution ever acknowledge what happened behind the chapel fence? Yard 14 was administered by Alden K. Trussell, a soft-spoken municipal officer known for his punctual reports and lavender-scented gloves, but an 1860 entry in the Trussell household's larder inventory shows repeated weekly purchases of powdered lime and thick muslin, quantities, doubling each month as more bodies arrived, and as silence deepened, Chapter 1 begins. Voce dis, now continue with Chapter 1, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script the beginning of the escalation, where you will report the first concrete signs that something is wrong, introduce witnesses, neighbors, or official records that mention unusual changes, describe scenes with sensory depth, e.g., creaking doors, dust in the air, etc. Reinforce the atmosphere of strangeness and apprehension. This part must contain between 1,100 and 500 words. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words such as unbelievable, attention, etc. Allowed examples: unbelievable, attention, okay. Do not use forbidden characters, tinit. Besios lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 1, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3, Roterista. Ingalls, longer horror. Disa. The first official mention of Yard 14 appears in a folded memorandum dated April 3, 1859, addressed to the Office of Public Sanitation, signed in brown ink by Alden K. Trussell. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, as if the letter had been penned in haste or in a humid room. The document requested urgent delivery of canvas sheeting and coal rations for use in temporary outdoor housing. Without citing a location, the parcel was archived with no reply recorded. Yet in the following weeks, a narrow footpath through the snow appeared behind the Baptist chapel on Mill Road, packed flat by dozens of boots. By mid-April, the frost had receded, revealing shallow trenches filled with lime and rotting cloth. The Baptist chapel, which had not held regular service since 1855, was considered too remote and too damp for worship by most parishioners. Its rear grounds backed onto the woodline, bordered on one side by an overgrown burial plot with no maintained headstones. On April 17th, 2 children from the neighboring Glass family reported seeing a mound of blankets with legs poking out near the tree line. Their mother, Edwina Glass, wrote to the township magistrate, describing a persistent smell, like spoiled vinegar and scorched meat, that had begun drifting into their parlor. Her letter was never entered into the town registry. By May, 3 men from the coal delivery yard resigned, citing an unworkable posting in their official termination forms. One of them, Osias Dunn, gave a sworn deposition to the court notary in June. His testimony described being instructed by Trussell himself to deliver barrels at a fenced enclosure behind Mill Road Chapel, where 2 boys in thick aprons met him and insisted on rolling the barrels inside themselves. Dunn claimed he had attempted to enter the enclosure, but was blocked by one of the boys, who wore a wool scarf pulled high over his nose despite the heat. Dunn said he glimpsed over the fence rows of sleeping men laid head to toe in canvas huts, and that the air carried a wet, iron sort of reek, like meat left in a forge. His account was filed and sealed. He was found drowned in the pond behind the tannery 3 weeks later. Inside the town's own records, Yard 14 remained unnamed, mentioned only in Trussell's internal requisitions for supplies. These included obscure items such as powdered alum, metal tongs, thick hemp rope, and a large hand-crank water pump. The requisitions ceased mentioning medical staff after early June. No physician in Yorkshire would admit to having visited the site. The local apothecary, Newton Meal, stated in a private journal entry dated June 11th, "Returned from late delivery, he would not meet my eye, hands trembling, refused tonic, asked only for more cloth and bleeding pan, said to burn the receipt." The entry ends with the phrase underlined twice, "They are not coughing blood, they are leaking it." The first surviving map that includes the yard is dated July 1859 and was drawn by a schoolboy named Cornelius Beale as part of a geography assignment. The crude ink sketch, rediscovered in 1931 in a trunk in the Beale family attic, depicts the chapel and surrounding woods and includes a misshapen square labeled "Camp for Sick, No Windows." Cornelius's teacher gave him a failing mark, citing inappropriate subject matter. By then, however, it was no longer a secret. The surrounding community had begun noticing more than just the smell. Mrs. Letitia Darrow, a widow who lived 2 doors down from the Trussells, kept a daily logbook of her garden yields. On July 19th, she noted a decrease in bees, writing that her hives were silent for the 3rd day running. She attributed it to the strange heavy vapors she saw rising most mornings just before sunup from behind the chapel. A few pages later, on July 29th, she wrote, "Saw Alden today near the grocer's. His shoes were sticky, and he left prints on the shop floor. Couldn't meet my eyes, I don't think he's well." She died the following winter, but her journal remained preserved in the Historical Society's collection, unopened until 1978. Inside the enclosure, life was narrowing into a kind of limbo. Testimonies taken decades later by descendants of labourers who helped assemble the site describe the interior layout: 4 long canvas barracks, each subdivided by hanging blankets. Soaked in vinegar, the patients were fed by ladle through slits in the curtain. Only 1 latrine had been dug. At night, workers said, they could hear the rustling of feet pacing, always pacing, as if no one inside dared to lie down too long. One worker, Simon Greaves, recalled that a bell rang once in the dark when someone expired. He said no one was allowed to answer it. Between August and September, Yorkshire's newspaper, the Weekly Sentinel, published a series of strangely worded announcements. None used the word illness. Instead, they reported a temporary housing district under the care of Mr. Trussell and praised the quiet resilience of those undergoing transition. There were no images, only sketches of ivy-covered fences and workers' hands. Yet by September 10th, the Weekly Sentinel stopped publishing altogether. Its final editorial, unsigned, included a single line that would later be quoted in state hearings: "It is not our place to ask, only to bear witness." Meanwhile, Trussell's own behaviour had begun to fray at the edges. Known for his punctuality, he missed 3 consecutive town meetings in August. His carriage was seen more often parked outside the old chapel than at the town office. On September 2nd, the postmaster returned a parcel addressed to the Trussell home that had not been collected. The parcel, documented in the postal ledger, contained a crate of ceramic bowls and 4 jars of horehound lozenges. When the postmaster visited the Trussell house personally, he found the curtains drawn and the front steps covered in a fine powder that smelled like ash. That same week, the town blacksmith Elijah Kern recorded that he had been hired to create a metal inspection stick, 7 feet in length, with a hook on one end. He was told it would be used to check drainage inside canvas huts. The payment came from municipal funds, but no invoice was ever signed. By mid-September, children were forbidden from walking alone past Mill Road. The headmaster of the Yorkshire schoolhouse issued a notice advising parents to avoid the northern perimeter of chapel property. Despite this, an older boy named Thomas Winton, aged 12, snuck into the camp perimeter and sketched what he saw. His pencil drawing, crude but detailed, shows lines of men seated cross-legged, heads drooping forward, each with a strip of cloth across their eyes. Thomas claimed they were singing softly but out of rhythm, and one of them raised a hand to his mouth as if to catch something. The drawing is dated September 18th. Thomas was withdrawn from school 2 weeks later with no explanation. Inside Town Hall, records show Trussell signed off on end-of-season closure preparations for the yard on October 3rd. There are no subsequent entries regarding disposal, relocation or burial. The supply requisitions ended. The coal shipments ceased. No one spoke again of Yard 14 for over a decade, but the Trussell property began to decline. The garden grew wild and the shutters stayed closed. In October, 2 labourers hired to repair the chimney walked off the job, leaving their tools behind. One of them told the foreman he saw a figure standing in the attic window, but when called to, it did not move. The other refused to speak. Both men quit town within the week. Voce Gisi. Now continue with Chapter 1, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script beginning of the escalation. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly, Chapter 1, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Rotirista, Inglis Longer Horror Dis. The first confirmed casualty connected to Yard 14 within town limits was a school clerk named Mr. Aaron Cleves, age 39, who was employed to copy ledgers at the municipal archive. On October 9, 1859, he collapsed while shelving documents in the back storeroom. Witnesses described him falling forward as if sleep had struck him like a club. When a physician arrived, Cleves was still breathing, but his fingertips and lips had turned black. He never regained consciousness. The autopsy listed asphyxiation due to internal clotting, a term that did not exist in standard medical references of the time. His body was interred the same night under the direction of Alden Trussell, who arrived at the site in a closed carriage and signed the burial form without removing his gloves. Only after Cleves's death did whispers begin inside the clerical community. Cleves had reportedly been working on compiling township supply logs for the previous 6 months. His widow, Mildred, claimed he had grown increasingly anxious at home, often staring into the fireplace long after it had gone cold. In the final week before his collapse, he was seen scribbling numbers on scraps of paper, then tearing them up. One scrap, partially preserved in the lining of his coat, listed a column of dates from April to September, each followed by quantities of coal and fabric. At the bottom, the word discrepancy appeared twice. Trussell's name was not mentioned, but every quantity matched entries from Yard 14 requisition forms. Mildred Cleves attempted to submit the fragment to the town ledger office, but it was not accepted. She left Yorkshire by November. Simultaneously, the Baptist chapel, long considered abandoned, began showing signs of human presence beyond the yard. On the morning of October 12th, the town's lamplighter, Isaiah Roke, reported seeing a lantern flickering behind the chapel's broken stained-glass window just before dawn. He approached the fence, calling out, but received no answer. When he stepped closer, he noticed small piles of discarded cloth in the grass, each one stained and knotted at the center like makeshift gags or tourniquets. He made a note in his journal that day. Not sleeping well, dreamed I saw Trussell with a candle, walking between open mouths. That same week, the Yorkshire Sewing Guild convened for its monthly meeting. 6 members were absent, citing illness or household emergencies. The group's leader, Mrs. Frances Bevel, gave an account the following spring during a deposition for unrelated civil charges. She described receiving private orders through a municipal runner to sew face veils with thick muslin and strong thread, Each veil was to be secured with a tie behind the head and stitched closed at the mouth. No explanation was offered. She produced one sample during the deposition, but was advised not to discuss the request publicly. Her name vanished from guild rosters in early 1860. One of the few outside observers to leave a detailed, unfiltered record was Deacon Thomas Veal, who kept a private diary chronicling town affairs. In an entry dated October 21st, he wrote, "The evening air brings a high whine, almost a whistle, from behind the chapel. I dared walk near it. Through the trees I saw forms, sitting, not lying, under hanging canvas. They do not move. They are wrapped in their own stillness, and the stillness breathes." His final entry that autumn notes seeing Alden Trussell alone, scraping the side of a barrel with a flat metal tool, his hands raw. At the town infirmary, cases of respiratory weakness and sudden bleeding began to appear by late October. Nurses described patients arriving with no outward wounds, but heavy internal bruising. One patient, a cart driver named Jules Henrik, claimed to have transported covered crates from the chapel grounds to the river ferry. He insisted that the crates moved when no one touched them. By the time he reached the infirmary, both his eyes were bloodshot and he could barely speak. A nurse recorded that his mouth smelled of copper. He died within hours. No official cause was listed, and his body was taken by municipal order, not returned to the family. As October waned, frost returned to Yorkshire, and Yard 14 seemed to recede from public sight once more. But a silence had taken hold in town offices and shops, a silence noticeable in conversation and paperwork alike. Reports that once mentioned the chapel in passing now simply referred to Zone B. The coal merchants no longer logged deliveries past the mill road, and those who spoke of the camp did so only in terms of supply, not people. Then, on November 3rd, a wagon overturned near the camp's side gate. The driver, Alfred Lance, had been attempting to leave a shipment of vinegar barrels when one of the horses panicked. The cart tipped and broke open a side panel, revealing contents not recorded on the invoice, a set of folded garments sealed in waxed paper, each tagged with a number and a faint ink stamp that read "Inventory closed." Lance, who survived with a broken leg, gave a confused account to the town constable, saying he never looked inside, never asked, never wanted to know. He was not charged, but was advised to avoid speaking with journalists. Among those who did try to investigate was a young printing apprentice named Elias Munro, aged 22, who had taken it upon himself to document what he called municipal inconsistencies. He was last seen on November 10th, walking toward the chapel grounds with a pocket journal and a hand mirror, claiming he intended to look around corners. His disappearance was noted only in the margin of a typeset proof for an unprinted newspaper edition. In pencil, one line reads, "Elias gone too long. If not back by dusk, burn page." As the first snow of the season fell in mid-November, the outline of Yard 14 became visible, only as a ripple in the landscape. The tents had been removed, leaving behind rectangular depressions in the frost-covered soil. The wooden posts of the perimeter fence remained, but most were leaning. Trussell filed a final requisition on November 19th for a shipment of lime and 4 pounds of camphor. The document includes no destination, only a municipal code. The handwriting is faint, as though the pen were held with shaking hands. By late November, an eerie consensus had settled over Yorkshire. People spoke less. Streets emptied earlier. Children were kept inside. In public offices, the name Trussell was no longer spoken aloud, though his signature remained on dozens of closing forms and supply audits. The Baptist chapel had no further visitors, and one morning a notice appeared nailed to its door. Closed for reformation. It bore no official seal. The last entry in the town's winter registry that year includes a payment authorization to sundry unnamed municipal actors for deep terrain correction and spiritual remediation. The funds were disbursed in gold coin, not banknotes, and the page ends with a smudge where a signature had been started and abruptly abandoned. Voce dis. Now continue with Chapter 2, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script escalation, where you will show how events become more disturbing and impossible to ignore. Introduce external figures, investigators, journalists, authorities, religious figures, and their first impressions. Add contradictions, disappearance of evidence, and conflicting accounts. Increase the tension with every sentence, preparing the viewer for the climax. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista. Ingles longa hora dice, the first outsider to file an inquiry with the Yorkshire Council came not from medicine or law, but from the Congregational Union. Reverend Silas Dorr, recently assigned to the Essex Missionary Circuit, arrived in town on December 4, 1859. Tall, with pale, brittle skin and a clean black coat that never seemed to wrinkle, he introduced himself as an observer of divine stewardship. He had received word from 2 former parishioners in Yorkshire, sisters who had relocated to nearby Peabody, that their hometown bore a silence unnatural for the season. Dorr travelled alone, carrying only a Bible, a ledger book, and a sealed letter of endorsement from his regional superior. His first formal visit was to the municipal offices on Sutton Street. According to an unsigned clerk's note found years later among discarded tax rolls, Dorr was told there had been no registered epidemic, no deaths beyond the seasonal average, and no cause for theological concern. But the Reverend recorded his own impressions in a small journal bound in grey calfskin. The December 5th entry reads, "Windows shut tight, no hearth smoke by noon, postmaster speaks in one-syllable phrases. All seem to move quickly, yet no one appears to be going anywhere." On his second day, Dorr requested to visit the chapel. He was refused. The reason provided, according to his notes, was that the grounds were pending reassignment under winter. Repair protocols. When he asked to speak with Alden Trussell, he was told Mr. Trussell had taken indefinite leave, but on that same morning, Dorr saw a man matching Trussell's description leaving the rear door of the town records office, carrying a canvas satchel. Determined to gather evidence discreetly, Dorr took residence at the Greenwill Inn, where he began asking questions under the guise of preparing a sermon for local youth. Several townspeople confided in him. A former milkmaid, Annabel Cratch, said she had delivered to the Trussell home for 7 years, but was turned away in early November. She said it didn't smell of sickness, Dorr wrote, but of something covered up, like dried ink and old bread. A tinsmith described seeing crates offloaded behind the chapel in the middle of the night, handled not by workers, but by what he called gentlefolk, clean shoes and gloves, but no voices. Dorr noted, "They do not whisper, they only nod." What disturbed the Reverend most was the pattern in the stories. They were all half-told. People would begin, then pause, eyes drifting, unsure whether they were recalling memory or dream. One woman claimed she had signed to help stitch burial shrouds, but was never paid. Another mentioned that her brother had worked briefly at the rear grounds, but refused to sleep indoors afterward. The phrase appeared again and again. Rear grounds. Never camp, never yard. By December 9th, Dorr had compiled 12 pages of observations and resolved to make a formal complaint to the Essex Board of Public Health. That letter never arrived. Meanwhile, in Boston, a young reporter from the Journal of Reform, Elias K. Mason, had received an anonymous envelope containing clippings of requisition slips and a partial list of coal deliveries marked for a Zone B. Intrigued by the irregularities and the mention of unreported deaths, Mason made the journey to Yorkshire by train on December 11th. He carried a notebook, a small brass-cased camera, and a copy of the state's Municipal Transparency Statute. Upon arriving, Mason found the station unattended. The ticket booth was closed and there were no porters. He walked through town and noted that no homes displayed wreaths or candles for the holiday season. The few pedestrians he passed wore gloves and scarves pulled high, avoiding eye contact. At the inn, the guest book showed only one other occupant, S. Dorr. Mason and Dorr met late that night in the common room. They compared notes. Dorr shared his unease. Mason showed the delivery slips. The handwriting on several matched trussels. They agreed to visit the chapel grounds together at dawn, but the next morning, Mason woke to find Dorr gone. His room was undisturbed, the bed made, his coat and boots still there. The innkeeper claimed he had checked out during the night, leaving a single coin and no message. Mason waited 3 hours, then walked to the chapel alone. He found the path to the rear grounds partially obscured by snow but still visible, boot prints shallow and regular, led from the fence post to a half-sunken depression where canvas remnants clung to the ground like peeled skin. He climbed the fence and entered what had once been the enclosure. Inside, the wind carried no sound but its own. The shapes in the snow were not random. They formed rows, interrupted only by narrow trenches. Mason photographed them. But when he returned to the inn, the camera's film plate was blank. No images. Just a faint fog, as if the emulsion had failed. He asked for supplies to try again, but was told the general store had closed early for private inventory. The clerk did not meet his eyes. Mason's written account, published only posthumously, detailed what followed. He attempted to requisition burial records from the town office, but was told that no burials had taken place in the district that year. He requested access to census rolls. Denied. When he asked about Alden Trussell, the clerk offered a small smile and said, "We all serve in the way we're asked." Frustrated, Mason approached the local telegraph office to send a dispatch to Boston. The telegraph operator accepted his message, but claimed the lines were down due to snow. Mason waited. He returned the next morning. Same answer. On his final visit, the telegraph key itself had been removed. On December 16th, Mason was seen boarding the early freight train out of town. Witnesses recall he looked pale, shoulders hunched, and did not carry the camera he had arrived with. The Journal of Reform never published his story. A note from his editor stated simply, he withdrew the submission, said it was incomplete. Back in Yorkshire, records show that the chapel's fence was dismantled on December 21st by a crew from the Municipal Landworks Department. No explanation was offered. The work order listed the reason as seasonal grounds consolidation. The crew consisted of 6 men. By January, 2 had left town. 1 filed for a disability pension, citing nervous tremors. Another, Daniel Finch, was admitted to a private convalescent home in Lowell. When visited by his brother in spring, Finch refused to discuss Yorkshire. He spent the rest of his life under care, never speaking above a whisper. Around the same time, an envelope containing Reverend Dorr's grey journal arrived at the Essex Congregational Archive. It bore no return address. The pages had been reordered. Several had been removed. A note tucked between the final 2 pages read, in delicate cursive, "Be cautious in how you preserve silence. Sometimes it is louder than memory." Voce Dis, now continue with Chapter 2, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script. Escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Inglis longa hora dice. Snowfall deepened in Yorkshire as the year turned. By early January 1860, the wind carved ridges across Mill Road and piled drifts along the low fence, line that once enclosed Yard 14, yet something remained beneath the snow, more felt than seen. Hunters passing through reported their dogs refusing to cross the chapel's shadow. One of them, Eustace Hollowell, a veteran trapper, described hearing a low metallic creaking coming from the chapel grounds at dusk, like hinges under strain or a pulley turning without load. His companion laughed at the time, but Hollowell sold his traps a week later and left the state. In Boston, faint ripples of concern had begun reaching institutional circles. The Essex Board of Public Health received an unsigned report on January 6th, describing anomalous patterns of supply and disappearance linked to a site referred to only as Y14. Though the letter bore no name, its phrasing echoed the style of Reverend Dawes' early notes. An internal memo circulated among board members recommended dispatching an external surveyor. Before spring melt makes retrospective analysis unreliable. The man selected was Clarence Stillwell, aged 47, a former military quartermaster turned civil auditor, known for his unshakable demeanor and preference for silence over speculation. Stillwell arrived in Yorkshire on January 11th, dressed in a dark wool coat and polished boots, with a regulation-bound logbook tucked beneath his arm. His presence did not go unnoticed. Several residents watched from behind lace curtains as he passed through the town square. He was lodged by arrangement at the rectory annex, Reverend Dawes' room still intact, his belongings gone, dust already thick along the floorboards. Stillwell's log begins formally. Arrival uneventful. Initial impressions: town exhibits reluctance to engage, offices maintained but avoidant, weather dry, temperatures severe. On his first day, he presented formal credentials to the clerk at the records office, requesting supply ledgers and census entries between April and December 1859. The clerk returned 30 minutes later with an apology. Volumes lost in fire. Stillwell pressed. He was offered duplicates but found them altered. Quantities did not match invoices he had been provided before departure. Footnotes had been removed. Signatures were missing. Undeterred, he visited the site. On January 12th, Stillwell walked the former perimeter of Yard 14 with a measuring rod and compass, mapping what he described as depressions inconsistent with drainage. His notes indicate at least 16 shallow sink points in a 30 by 60 foot space, each aligned to the dimensions of what could have been canvas barracks, yet none showed evidence of anchors or tie-downs. One depression contained fragments of cloth frozen into the earth. He wrote that the fabric resisted tongs and yielded a faint medicinal odor when disturbed. That evening, he returned to the rectory and wrote for over 3 hours by candlelight. His writing becomes less clinical. No signage, no markers, no ash. But the ground bears memory, the cold does not mask it. Stillwell was not a man of metaphor, and the tone shift suggests more than professional unease. The next day, he attempted to contact the board via telegraph. The operator on duty, Henry Voss, a volunteer since 1856, recorded the interaction in a side ledger. Stillwell submitted a sealed cipher. Transmission refused. Line temporarily diverted for legal reasons. That phrase, legal reasons, had never before appeared in Voss's logs. Stillwell's message was returned unopened. That night, someone entered the rectory annex. Stillwell found his satchel overturned and his logbook damp, though it had not rained or snowed indoors. Meanwhile, the chapel itself had begun to draw renewed scrutiny. Although the grounds had been officially cleared, several townspeople claimed to hear activity inside at night. Soft movements, the dragging of something heavy, and once, faint humming. 3 boys from the outskirts, aged 10 to 13, crept to the edge of the grounds after dark and swore they saw a dim light flicker through the warped boards near the rear door. One of them, Owen Trask, later reported in confession that he saw a man sitting cross-legged in the snow, eyes open, unmoving. "He looked at us," Owen said, "but he didn't blink, and his mouth wasn't closed." In his final journal entry dated January 15th, Stillwell notes preparing an itemized report for secure delivery. "I will ride to Peabody myself," he writes, "and place it into certified hands." That report was never received. Stillwell's horse was found tied outside the Peabody stables 3 days later. His satchel was still strapped to the saddle. The inner pouch had been opened and emptied. Back in Yorkshire, the official response to his disappearance was subdued. A notice was placed in the town registry stating, "Mr. Stillwell has concluded his temporary residence with approval and will be continuing his work elsewhere." No inquiry followed, but changes in town behavior became impossible to ignore. The bakery ceased opening on Thursdays. Windows remained shuttered long past sunrise. Public readings and lectures were cancelled indefinitely. One by one, even the churches stopped tolling bells for Sunday service. 2 more officials arrived at the end of January, Martha Dell and Royce Callan, auditors from the Massachusetts Office of Rural Affairs. Their assignment was ostensibly unrelated to Yard 14, a regional census recalibration effort, but both had access to infrastructure records. Upon their arrival, they were housed at the shuttered schoolhouse, repurposed as temporary lodging. Within 2 days, their report included the following line: extensive civil discrepancies noted regarding supply flow and administrative personnel between April and November. Internal sealing protocols may have been bypassed. The sentence was later struck from the final report. Dell and Callan made one visit to the chapel site, accompanied by a municipal guide. According to Dell's private field notes, recovered from her home after her death, they observed no physical evidence of former structures, but an inexplicable coolness at soil level, inconsistent with surface temperature. She also noted that the guide refused to walk beyond the fence line and recited what appeared to be a rehearsed explanation. This place was a necessary stage. Nothing remains. The auditors returned to Boston. Their final summary, 4 pages long, omitted any mention of Trussell, Yard 14, or the missing registry entries. However, in the margin of 1 page, next to the phrase, "archival preservation not warranted," someone had penciled in, "Who decides what decays?" By early February, correspondence in and out of Yorkshire declined sharply. Postal entries dropped by over 60% compared to the previous winter. Trains passed through without stopping. The town's name was quietly excluded from updated regional maps. Its cartographic label became a faint mark beside a rail line. No junction, no population, no features. Yet for those still watching, former residents, distant relations, occasional archivists, the questions multiplied. Why had the chapel not been demolished? Why did no death toll emerge from a camp meant to house 138 ill persons? Why did every attempt to investigate yield only partial truths or vanished witnesses? And why, in the most recent winter directory, was Alden K. Trussell still listed as active municipal staff with no departure date recorded? Voce Dis. Now continue with Chapter 3. Part 1. This chapter represents in the script confrontation or discovery. Report the most intense and revealing moment, discovery of bodies, files, forbidden objects, hidden rooms, etc. Describe every visual and auditory detail realistically, avoiding gratuitous gore but not concealing the gravity. Show the reactions of witnesses and authorities in the face of the revealed horror. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Rotearista, Ingles Longa Horror Dice. On the morning of February 17, 1860, a letter arrived at the Boston office of the Massachusetts Rural Affairs Bureau, addressed by hand in black ink, with no return address. The envelope was coarse, cut from repurposed stock and sealed with resin rather than wax. Inside, on a single folded sheet, was a message written in trembling script. You will find what you seek beneath the chapel floor. Take care in how you uncover it. There was no signature. The paper carried a bitter smell of old ash and damp wool. The letter was received by Royce Callan, recently returned from Yorkshire and already facing internal review for omitting key findings. He did not report the letter immediately. Instead, he arranged for a private wagon to return him to Yorkshire by the end of the week, accompanied by a municipal constable named Elijah Durran, whose name appeared in no official record of any subsequent report. They arrived on the evening of February 19th, under a sky so low and grey it seemed to press against the tops of chimneys. The chapel loomed at the far end of Mill Road, its stone facade streaked with frozen moss, its narrow windows sealed with tin and thick planks. No townspeople were in sight, though thin smoke rose from 2 chimneys in the distance. Durran and Callan approached the chapel without ceremony. The snow around the structure was uneven, sunken in places, as though the earth had shifted underfoot. Inside, the air was still. The front door creaked open with little resistance. Callan stepped first onto the floorboards, flashlight in hand. A soft scuff followed, Durran dragging his heel across a seam in the wood. The chapel pews had been removed. The walls were bare except for watermarks and faint smudges in the plaster where framed scriptures once hung. The pulpit remained, but its base had been shattered inward as though struck from below. Callan moved toward the altar. He crouched, placing his ear against the floorboards. After a moment he stood and nodded to Durran, who retrieved a crowbar from his coat. The wood gave after 4 sharp strikes. The noise echoed too long. Beneath the splintered boards lay a shallow crawl space, barely 3 feet deep. The ground dry and tamped flat, except in one place, where the soil had buckled upward into a broad, uneven mound. They descended with care. Durran went first, his boots crunching faintly as they met the packed dirt. He paused, then stepped aside. Callan crouched beside the mound and brushed the surface with his gloved hand. What emerged was not a coffin or container, but a patchwork mass of waxed linen, stitched roughly along the edges and soaked through in places with a dark, reddish residue. The smell hit next, sharp and acrid, like fermented sweat and rusted water. They pulled the linen aside together. Underneath lay the first of what would eventually be catalogued as 37 individual remains, though none were whole. Arranged in a tangled lattice, the bodies bore no signs of decay, yet the skin was sunken and taut, discolored in splotches, and marked by strange geometric scars. Limbs were folded against torsos with unnatural precision, and strips of cloth had been bound across the mouths and eyes of every figure. Some had nails driven through the hems of these bindings, anchoring them to the lower jaw or temples. Callan reeled backward. Durran turned away and vomited against the stone foundation wall. In the hours that followed, they opened 4 more mounds. All were similar. Some held only partial remains, torsos without heads, arms bound together at the wrist and fused by mildew. Others were nearly intact, but bore signs of manipulation, stitches along the spine, cloth pads inserted into the throat. In one, a child's body had been wrapped in lead sheet, its limbs fastened with copper wire. Callan made sketches. He used no camera. Durran catalogued details aloud, but his voice faltered as they uncovered the 6th mound, which contained a bundle of garments, shirts, coats, and dresses, all stamped with small printed tags. Each tag read only one word: finalized. Then they found the box. Buried beneath the eastern corner of the chapel floor was a shallow wooden crate, sealed with pitch and wrapped in oilcloth. It bore no markings on the exterior. Inside was a stack of ledgers, each hand-bound in coarse cloth, their pages dense with lists, diagrams, and coded symbols. The writing was neat, meticulous, and unmistakably in the hand of Alden K. Trussell. The first book contained intake logs, names, dates, physical conditions, origin towns. None of the names matched any publicly available death record. The second ledger detailed treatments, each patient identified by a numeric code. The methods listed were not medical. They included terms like recalibration interval, mouth occlusion retention, and containment reset. No explanation was offered. Some entries bore annotations in a second hand, initials AB and HK, with brief notes such as partial resistance, non-verbal compliant, or simply resolved. The third ledger was labeled Witness Adjustments. It included a table of names alongside remarks like transferred, instructed, and compensated. One entry dated August 29, 1859 read, Cleaves, A. Exposure risk. Preemptive shutdown via controlled hemorrhage. No burial required. Another, marked October 3rd, noted, Door S and unmanageable, rerouted. Callan closed the book with shaking hands. They emerged from the crawlspace near dawn, their clothes coated in dust and ash. Durran sat in silence on the chapel step. Callan paced in slow circles, holding the oilcloth-wrapped ledgers close to his chest. Neither man spoke for a long while. At 8:14 a.m., they walked to the town constabulary and demanded a secure filing of evidence. The duty officer on call, Gerard Vane, aged 29, refused to record the materials, claiming all documentation for unconfirmed municipal procedures required submission through state channels. When pressed, he threatened arrest for unlawful trespass on inactive property. Callan left without further protest. He and Durran returned to the rectory and sealed the ledgers in a travel chest. That evening, they arranged for a private coach to transport the documents directly to Boston. The chest never arrived. 2 days later, on February 22nd, a minor rail incident near Ipswich disrupted several outbound lines. Among the reports was a notice of one damaged cargo coach, unmarked, lightly burned, and missing all internal freight. No casualties were recorded. No passenger manifest listed either Callan or Durran. Back in Yorkshire, word of the discovery never spread. The chapel was quietly boarded again. The entry in the town's maintenance log read simply, "Structural degradation. Access restricted." The field where Yard 14 once stood was reassigned for agricultural rotation in spring. Of the bodies recovered beneath the floor, only 6 were granted burial. The remainder were categorized as medical samples and requisitioned by a federal research annex in Andover. Their current location is unknown. Voce 10. Now continue with Chapter 3, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Confrontation or Discovery. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory. No exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, montam, lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 3, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles Longer Horror, Dice. 2 weeks after the burned freight coach was discovered near Ipswich, an unmarked parcel was delivered to the Massachusetts Rural Affairs Bureau. Wrapped in rough muslin and tied with unbleached twine, the bundle contained a single item, the third ledger from the crate under the chapel floor. There was no note, no return address. The book smelled of mildew and wood ash. Its pages were partially warped but intact. None of the other ledgers nor the chest itself were ever recovered. The ledger's reappearance triggered a brief stir inside the bureau, but it was quickly redirected to a restricted archival shelf, labeled Incomplete Field Artifact, Context Unknown. For decades it remained sealed in muslin, referenced only once in a footnote within a classified sanitation audit of Essex County. But one man made a copy. Wallace Edin, a junior clerk in the Bureau's registry annex, transcribed most of the ledger over 6 nights in March 1860. He used rice paper and a narrow steel nib, keeping his work hidden under his desk drawer. Edin had no known connection to the events in Yorkshire, yet his notes suggest a growing compulsion. "There's something in the numbers," he wrote in a margin. "If one reads them as process, not history, it forms a pattern. Not random, not response, deliberate." His transcription ended abruptly on March 18th, with the last entry reading, "Trussell, perpetual custodian, not absent, merely reclassified." Edin resigned 2 days later. He relocated to Oregon Territory and never returned to public service. Back in Yorkshire, early thaw exposed what winter had hidden. On March 4th, a team of field hands contracted to prepare the grounds east of the chapel reported uncovering irregular patches of burnt earth and residual cloth. A supervisor noted several rows of disturbed topsoil, each marked by discoloration and a faint, briny smell. When one laborer attempted to dig further, his spade struck wood. What emerged was a charred, lidless box containing dozens of iron hooks. all of identical make and length, still wrapped in singed muslin. The discovery was not reported to the town office. The tools were buried again, and the field was planted with flax 2 weeks later. In private, however, the story spread. By mid-March, townspeople were whispering about the strange unease returning to Mill Road. A merchant named Carson Hobbs claimed he saw a child walking barefoot through the chapel yard in snowmelt, trailing a length of cloth behind her. When he called out, she didn't turn. She stepped into the woodline and vanished. A search turned up nothing. Hobbs left town within the month. It was around this time that new files began to disappear from the Yorkshire Clerk's archive. Census data from the 1859-1860 period was reported in review, then marked pending, then vanished entirely. When a visiting official from Worcester requested tax ledgers from that same year, he was told the records had been transferred to State Depository. No receipt of transfer could be found. 3 volumes of the town's medical officer reports, formerly stored in the lower archives, had also gone missing. The only remaining folder from that period contained an incomplete list of supply recipients, with the phrase Zone B terminal entries suspended scrawled diagonally across the final page. Within private households, the silence deepened. Several families who had once received coal or flour stipends from Trussell's office began to speak of discrepancies. Letters requesting aid went unanswered. A widow named Eleanor Vale wrote directly to the state's charitable board, claiming she had not received food vouchers in 3 months. Her letter was returned with "Recipient relocated" stamped across the envelope. Her home stood empty by April. The chapel remained untouched. On April 12th, a new development broke the stalemate. A Boston-based professor of antiquarian studies, Dr. Silas Emery, arrived in Yorkshire unannounced, claiming to have received fragments of Trussell's work through an undisclosed archival channel. Emery was a tall, gaunt man with wire spectacles and an obsessive temperament, known for his lectures on unregulated burial practices in early American colonies. He took a room above the butcher's shop and made immediate arrangements to access the old chapel. On his 3rd day, Emery gained entry through the rear cellar using a key obtained by unclear means. What he found was not just the aftermath of the crawlspace excavation, but evidence of a much older substructure beneath the stone foundation. Emery's field notes, discovered posthumously in his satchel, describe a lower corridor, accessible through a narrow passage concealed behind the altar's eastern pillar. The corridor, only 4 feet high, ran under the chapel floor and extended 20 feet toward the cemetery slope. Along its walls were iron rings embedded at regular intervals. The ceiling bore soot marks. The floor was layered in gravel, scattered with remnants of burned cloth, broken glass, and rusted instruments. At the end of the corridor stood a wooden partition, behind which Emery reported finding a small hexagonal chamber. In its center, a metal basin fused to the floor, surrounded by a circle of scorched wooden staves. Around the perimeter of the chamber were wooden cabinets built into the wall. Each cabinet held folded paper parcels, now crumbling with age, and one sealed clay urn. Emery removed the urn. He never opened it. He left Yorkshire on April 17th, boarding the night train to Boston with the urn wrapped in linen and secured in a crate. According to the station manifest, he signed his own name and listed his destination as the Boston College of Antiquarian Medicine. But Emery never arrived. The crate was discovered 4 days later in a siding yard north of Cambridge, its interior empty except for a piece of paper bearing the words, "Entry was never granted." No one has claimed authorship of that note. Following Emery's disappearance, a final sweep of the chapel was ordered, this time by state mandate citing incomplete structural survey. A team of 5 entered the site on May 1st, accompanied by a clerk to record the proceedings. The report they filed is terse. The corridor Emery described had collapsed. The walls bore signs of recent fire. The embedded iron rings were gone. The cabinets were splintered and empty. The basin had been removed entirely, leaving only a circular imprint in the dirt. The report closes with one final line: "Site does not warrant further preservation." The chapel was officially condemned on May 14th. No demolition was scheduled. In the following months, townspeople resumed their routines with cautious rigidity. A new clerk was appointed to replace Trussell's long vacant position. His name was Thomas Peary, and he spoke little of what had come before. When asked about the chapel, he reportedly replied, "Whatever it was, it is finished." But on the town's summer census, under the column marked non-residential occupants, someone had written in pencil, 138 entered, 0 removed. No one corrected it. Vosidisi, now continue with Chapter 4, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script consequences and legacy. Report the outcome. Arrests, closures, trials, political or social changes. Show how the community and collective memory dealt with the case in the following years. Conclude with an enigmatic and unsettling final sentence that leaves a lingering doubt in the viewer's mind. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary. Summary, prompt or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 4, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 roteirista, ingles longa horror dice. By the summer of 1860, a thin layer of bureaucratic moss had grown over every trace of Yard 14. The state did not acknowledge the site publicly. No indictments were issued, no disciplinary hearings convened. Instead, a series of routine staffing reallocations shifted key officials away from Yorkshire, most of them quietly retired with full pensions. Alden K. Trussell's name vanished from payrolls after June 3rd. No forwarding address was recorded. His property was listed as municipal holding and sold at silent auction 3 years later. The chapel remained standing. A single article in the Lowell Observer dated July 16th made vague reference to peculiar procedures regarding indigent housing in eastern Essex, but it was buried on page 4 between livestock prices and theatre listings. The journalist who submitted the piece, a young woman named Helen Vass, never filed another. Her family claimed she left for New York in August, though no employment record or residence has ever surfaced under her name. Inside Yorkshire, a new pattern of silence had taken hold. Residents resumed outward routines, market stalls reopened, school resumed, but the town's inner voice fell quiet. The name Trussell was no longer spoken. Children were told only that the chapel was not in use. The cemetery behind it, once wild and overgrown, was trimmed and levelled by town workers, then fenced off entirely. A brass plaque was affixed to the gate in October 1860. Preservation District, no entry without permit. A few tried to pursue justice. Former municipal coal supplier Josiah Meeks filed a civil complaint regarding unpaid invoices and missing delivery logs. The complaint was dismissed without hearing. The courthouse clerk cited records unavailable. Meeks relocated to Fitchburg that winter and left no forwarding correspondence. His warehouse burned the following spring in what the fire marshal called a clean ignition, no accidental source. 2 junior clerks from the Massachusetts Rural Affairs Bureau resigned in protest over the handling of the Stilwell report. Their resignation letters, preserved in a side archive, mention incomplete transmission, state-coordinated disavowals, and suppression of material evidence. Neither clerk found further employment in government. One died in a carriage accident in 1862. The other emigrated to Nova Scotia and refused interviews for the rest of his life. For the town's new administration, the focus turned to land use and rebranding. In the fall of 1860, the surrounding acreage, including the field where the canvas huts once stood, was parceled for agricultural incentives under the Agricultural Renewal Grant Act. A single recipient, a merchant farmer named Cecil Brand, acquired all 3 parcels under different aliases. He cleared the land, planted fast-growing barley, and posted 3 workers to maintain the crops. Within 2 seasons, the soil was reported as highly productive but temperamental. One worker described the ground as soft, even dry, like it breathes. No formal complaints were filed. In 1861, the town council quietly redrew the municipal boundary to exclude the chapel grounds from the Yorkshire Register. A cartographic addendum was filed without vote, and from that point forward, the land ceased appearing on civic documentation. When questioned by a state archivist in 1863, the council's chairman replied, "The site in question has completed its administrative purpose." No further comment was made. Cultural memory followed suit. No official histories of Yorkshire written after 1862 mention Yard 14 or its occupants. Church records skip over the years 1858 to 1860 entirely, citing insufficient documentation. The name of Alden Trussell appears only once more in a side column of the Massachusetts Municipal Register, where he is listed as inactive pending restructuring. His death was never recorded. Still, fragments persisted. In 1864, a traveling schoolteacher named Martha Linscott wrote in a personal letter to her sister, "These people do not laugh. They wait. I asked once about the chapel, and a man dropped a spoon and did not pick it up again." The letter was dated from Yorkshire, sent from a boarding house 2 streets from the old Baptist site. She left the town within 10 days and never returned to the region. A year later, a state geologist surveying soil for railway expansion passed near the former chapel boundary. His field notes, now housed in the Geological Survey Archive, include a brief description. Elevated iron trace, no source identified. Sound dampens sharply near center of field, readings inconsistent with natural formations. His proposed line was rerouted. The final known reference to Yard 14 within any administrative document occurred in 1867. A military census of unaccounted persons presumed indigent or deceased during civilian conflict years included a footnote under the Essex section. It read, "Urban Transit Quarantine Site, 14, entry denied, assumed settled." The term assumed settled was not standard language and appears in no other known census file from the period. Despite all efforts, the story did not vanish completely. An oil portrait found in an attic outside Gloucester in 1894 depicted a gaunt man in an old municipal officer's coat, one hand resting on a ledger, the other holding a candle. The painter's initials were scratched into the back, AKT. The frame was blackened along the bottom edge. The canvas has since disappeared, and every year, without announcement or coordination, fresh muslin strips have been found tied to the chapel gate in the early hours of February 17th. Always clean. Always hand-torn. No one claims them, no one removes them. Some say the wind carries a low sound near the chapel when the soil warms, something between humming and breath. Others believe it is only the trees settling. But each time it's heard, it stops the birds. Voce dis. Now continue with Chapter 4, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Consequences and Legacy. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. Attention. This is the final part of the script. This structure is mandatory. No exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of Chapter 4, Part 2, include this text exactly as written. Text. Write only and exactly. Chapter 4, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. Se 3 roterista ingles longa hora dice. By 1865, fewer than a dozen residents remained in Yorkshire who had lived through the period of the camp's operation. Most avoided direct recollection. A few kept silent not from fear, but from something closer to agreement. One of them, Bernard Hume, a retired coal hauler whose name appears on early supply ledgers, spoke once to a census taker in the spring of that year. The transcription from their exchange, preserved in a Boston Ledger audit, reads, "I know what I carried. I know what they did with it. If you think it was for warmth, you weren't there." Hume died that winter. His house was sold at auction. Inside the cellar, workers discovered a locked trunk containing tools, rolls of cloth and a set of gloves so deeply soaked in dried residue that they had stiffened into shape. The gloves were destroyed. The contents were listed on the inventory report, but never entered into evidence. A review commission briefly reconvened in 1866 to assess municipal failures in rural health management during the pre-war years. Led by Justice Caldwell Merriam, the commission reviewed dozens of missing person reports and budget anomalies across Essex County. When presented with fragments of the Trussell ledger, Merriam requested that all documentation related to Yard 14 or any other provisional housing facility not previously certified by state registry be expunged under Article 18 of the Public Containment Clause. He concluded the session with a single line: "There is no benefit in autopsy when the corpse has already been declared sacred." It was the last time any government official referenced the site in public, yet evidence continued to circulate, not in headlines or hearings, but in inheritance. In 1872, a set of boxed journals belonging to the late Reverend Silas Dorr surfaced during a private estate sale outside Lowell. The buyer, a seminary student named Elijah Brandt, claimed to have found in them a coded list of names, entries Dorr had, transcribed from the mouths of townspeople who believed their relatives had entered the camp and never returned. Each name was accompanied by a date and a letter grade. Some read C withdrawn, others more commonly R non-processed. A few bore only the mark H. Brandt donated the journals to a theological archive in Boston. Within 2 years, the archive was closed indefinitely due to structural instability. The building was demolished. The records never resurfaced. The land that once held Yard 14 passed through multiple hands by the 1880s, eventually absorbed into a larger estate, run by a regional grange co-op. Maps labeled the area only as M14, a designation that surveyors later believed referred to mineral rights. No structures were built there. A single wooden shed was erected in 1883 for seasonal storage, but burned under unknown circumstances the following spring. The co-op chose not to rebuild. A photograph taken in 1891 shows the field from a distance. It is flat, almost unnaturally so. In the lower right corner, near the edge of the frame, a set of small cloth markers protrude from the ground, arranged in a narrow arc. The photo was taken by a railway assessor documenting adjacent lands. He made no comment on the markers. By the turn of the century, Yorkshire no longer appeared on most regional directories. The town's population had fallen below 50. The schoolhouse was closed in 1894, the post office in 1896. The chapel remained locked and untouched. In 1902, a regional preservation society proposed converting it into a heritage site. The motion failed in subcommittee. One member anonymously submitted a note: "We do not commemorate experiments." Local folklore filled the void left by the vanished records. A song passed among children in nearby towns told of Trussell's house of linen men, who breathed through cloth and spoke through none. A nursery rhyme collected in Salem in 1911 references the yard of breathless sleepers beneath the whispering stone. No adult could say where the songs began. None of them were sung in Yorkshire. In 1924, a letter to the Boston Historical Society arrived from a woman identifying herself only as a former child of the fence. She described watching through cracks in the chapel boards as men in white coats moved quietly through the field. Behind it, placing pale flags like bookmarks in the grass. She claimed her mother had sewn some of the bindings used in the camp and was paid not in coin, but in ledger stamps. Her letter ended with a warning: "If you dig, it will not be bones you find, it will be permission." The letter was catalogued and filed. Its envelope bore no return address. Today, the land lies unmarked. The road that once led to the chapel has been overtaken by brush. The foundation stones remain half buried under thistle and rust-colored moss. In spring, certain sections of the soil produce a fine white flower that does not appear in any regional flora guides. Locals avoid the area. There are no paths, no signs, no commemorative plaques. What happened in Yorkshire was never prosecuted, never formally acknowledged, and never taught. But somewhere beneath the forgotten fields, the ground still carries the folds of canvas. And when the wind moves low and slow across the chapel's hollow frame, it does not sound like breath or wind. It sounds like someone waiting to speak. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.